Hello and welcome. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, and today we're talking about religious liberty, vaccine mandates, and religious exemptions. And, there's a tremendous amount of confusion around these issues. And so to help us sort through some of the questions and more today, I'm delighted to have with me two colleagues, Orlin Johnson, who is Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and Todd McFarland, who is Associate General Counsel for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us, Bettina.
So, Todd, let me start with you. We're hearing a lot from people who are just frankly confused about what religious exemptions to vaccine mandates are. What are these things? Who's entitled to them? What does the law say?
Sure. So for employees working for employers with 15 employees or more, there's two types of exemptions that are generally available. There's a medical or disability exemption. That is fairly narrow. You would have to show a particular medical condition that the vaccine would cause problems with. That's, again, pretty narrow. There's not a lot of those conditions out there. The second is a religious exemption that a person can ask for. What the law says, what the federal law says, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, says that employers have to provide an accommodation to sincerely held religious beliefs unless it would cause an undue hardship. So employees who have a religious exemption, not just a personal objection or a medical objection, but a religious one, can ask for an accommodation from their employer. And there's an entire process the employer would need to go through about whether or not to grant it, and if to grant it, how to grant it.
Okay, got it. So, let's hone in on that phrase, religious objection. So I'll turn to you, Orlin. When it comes to this religious exemption, what is the Adventist Church's stance on vaccines, just in general? Do our doctrines encourage people to refuse a vaccine?
Well, first of all, no, our doctrines don't refuse anyone to not engage in the vaccine, nor do we promote the vaccine in terms of what we're doing from our doctrinal standpoint. The language that we use is to basically inform everyone that obviously health principles and well-being of your body is something that's very important to all of us as Adventists. And we also recognize peer-reviewed literature as it relates to scientific information. And we strongly will encourage what we call responsible immunization and vaccine. And that term responsible really is in the eyes of the beholder or the individual who decides to engage. They determine what they view as being responsible. So if it's responsible vaccination, we encourage to let people know that we have no doctrinal beliefs that bar us from engaging. However, we still want to make clear that individuals can have their own personal religious objections, and those are things that they will be able to do because the federal law allows them to do so. But that is very different from doctrinal beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
So let's dig down deeper on this distinction you've just made between the official doctrinal stance of the church and someone's private individual religious convictions that may be either at variance or extend beyond the parameters of a church's doctrines. So are you implying that the Adventist Church will do nothing to support its church members whose personal religious beliefs may lead them to want to claim a religious exemption to a vaccine mandate?
Well, actually, to the contrary, not only are we helpful to Seventh-day Adventists and members of our denomination, but we are also helpful to anyone that may contact us in terms of receiving some assistance. For a number of years, the Adventist Church has always been out in the forefront of standing up for religious beliefs and also for one's personal religious exemptions. And that has been our task from almost the very beginning of the creation of our religion. And so this is something that's always been important to us. So we want to be out in the forefront in assisting people, and we assist individuals specifically in being able to craft their own personal letters requesting their religious beliefs. Because the important thing to understand is your religious exemption is actually your personal religious exemption It is not a denominational exemption. So it's not something you gain as a result of being connected to a denomination. It's something you are entitled to because of your own personal religious beliefs.
Okay, so that distinction is very clear. Now, let's take it forward to if an individual has pursued an individual religious exemption claim and it's been granted. Todd, give us a sense of what that actually means in practice. What does a religious exemption mean on the job?
Well, it depends on what the employer gave the exemption and what kind of accommodation they give. Generally speaking, employers get to choose the exemption. So, for instance, and this is being litigated right now, United Airlines exemption that it's given for its employees has been unpaid time off. And that's been almost an indefinite time period, or it's a set time period, but may be relooked at. Other employers, depending on the employee context, have allowed people to work from home. Other places, they may have put other protections in place, testing, et cetera. It's really impossible to say what an exemption looks like without looking at the job. Obviously, if you're an airline pilot or a flight attendant, it's hard to do that job from home. If, on the other hand, you're working in an IT department, perhaps that's an easier job to do remotely.
So are you saying that an individual who receives a religious exemption to a vaccine mandate doesn't have a sort of carte blanche to not wear a mask or to refuse testing?
They would
What are you
not.
saying?
Again, it really depends on what the employer gives them. But generally speaking, the employer gets to choose the accommodation, even if it's less favorable to the employee, and a more favorable one would be available as long as they remain reasonably employed. And it isn't the accommodation that the employee would necessarily want or prefer. So yes, wearing a mask or having regular testing would almost certainly be reasonable conditions of an accommodation or parts of an accommodation that an employee would have to sort of go along with.
Got it. Okay, Orlin, you are aware as Director of PAL for North American Division that this issue, it's just become so divisive.
Yes.
And not just general society, but it's also in the pews. We're seeing people who are disagreeing vehemently with each other. Do you have any suggestions for how we can sort of turn down the temperature on this a bit?
Yeah, well, I think first, it's clear that we have to understand that our church, in the environment that we are in, we are going to be a microcosm of society to some degree. However, we have been called upon to still be a peculiar people. And part of being peculiar is not simply going along with what a societal norm may be. We as Christians really have a mandate, and I use that term specifically, to be Christ-like in all that we do. And we don't have to get to a point that simply because we have a difference of opinion, that means that there has to be a division among us. So we can be different without division. And I think the love of Christ is what we need to always be viewing, because it's the love of Christ that constrains us. It'll never be our own personal beliefs or our own personal endeavors. And if we concentrate on Christ more as we have this conversation, I think that in and of itself will bring the temperature down on this whole dialogue.
And that is a perfect note to finish on. Orlin, Todd, thank you so much for shedding some light on these complex and frankly very troubling issues. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bettina.
And to those of you who have watched this conversation, we hope you found this mini webinar helpful. And if you have more questions, we'd encourage you to go and contact the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for your local union conference, because they're there and ready to answer your questions and to provide resources. And you can also check out COVID-related resources that are posted on the North American Division website. So until next time, take care.